Yeah, joining us to discuss all this, Chris Wilson. He's political pollster and the CEO of WPAi Intelligence. Chris, first of all, remind people of how a caucus is not a primary. So how should we translate these numbers for Bernie or anybody else when it comes to a caucus?
Well, that's exactly right. It's not a primary, and because of that, I think it's challenging for the polling to be accurate. I'll just remind your viewers that going into the 2016 caucus, Donald Trump was in first place in the Des Moines Register polling, and we, in the Ted Cruz campaign, I say we because I was director of polling and analytics on the campaign, ended up winning. And I'll just tell you that our internal polling never showed us down. And the difference there is who they're interviewing, because it's, to your exact point, it's difficult to get a sample of people who are actually going to attend the caucus. I'll give you another example here with Bernie Sanders in 2016, because the polling was pretty far off on his ultimate win. And what they saw was the polling did find that Sanders had a 70-point lead with voters under the age of 30. It was plus 70 with voters under the age of 30, and they just horribly undersampled how many of those would end up voting. So it is a challenge, I think, to get it right, particularly when you're not polling it regularly. This is the first one we've had in a long time. And the interesting point I'll make on that, the first one we've had in a long time, is it also is a qualifying poll for Andrew Yang, but he needs 2 more polls by the end of the day to actually make the Democratic debate. So there's a lot tied up into this, and I think the bottom line on it is Sanders is ultimately surging. He is doing well, and we're seeing this not just in Iowa, but in a lot of the early states. He's doing well in California. He's doing well in some recent polling I've seen in Maine, Vermont, Minnesota, and Colorado. And Sanders is looking increasingly like he might be the Democratic nominee for president, a socialist.
Chris, do polls influence the way people vote?
You know, another excellent question. I would argue that they do not, because particularly in Iowa, they do not. In some states, they may. But one of the things that you find when you go live in Iowa and run a campaign for president there is that those voters take their responsibility very seriously. I've heard a lot of criticism this year about Iowa being the first nation to vote in the Democratic caucus because of the lack of diversity. But I can promise you that every single voter who shows up to caucus can probably tell you more about the candidates than most members of the media can, who study them every day, because they go through the issues, they look at the endorsements, they in many cases meet them one-on-one, have them in their homes, and it does allow them to make a decision, I think, separate from polling. Now, as we get into Super Tuesday states, a lot's been made about the top 3 ticket coming out of Iowa. And the point of that is there's only once that there's been a nominee that didn't end up in the top 3. And in that case, it was McCain who finished close 4th. When you come out of Iowa in the top 3, you have a ticket to the rest of the nominees. And I think from that standpoint, yes, it matters as you move into into New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada. Now we have California in the mix there, and those early Super Tuesday states. So not so much in Iowa, but as we move on, yes, it does have an impact.
We've seen Elizabeth Warren have a shot. She went up, then she went down. Even Kamala Harris had a run. Pete Buttigieg, everybody. Biden's been relatively solid. How should we read the latest surge by Bernie?
Well, I think to go through each one of those, Warren, this was probably good news for her. It seems as if she stopped the bleeding, but she's still pretty far out of the lead here. And I would imagine you see her campaign end after New Hampshire because she's down there as well. Regarding Biden, he has been consistent, but he has consistently stayed flat or dropped a little bit. In this poll, he stayed flat from the last one, whereas you see other candidates like, again, Bernie Sanders for a while, yet Buttigieg, who were surging. Buttigieg clearly has lost all his momentum, and I think that campaign probably is coming to a close from a standpoint of just us talking about it being a serious contender. I think he stays in because he's really running for a cabinet position or maybe even the vice presidency on the ticket. Sanders' momentum to me seems different because he has built a campaign from the grassroots up. And so, in fact, when you look at Super Tuesday states, much has been made about that being the Biden firewall. But if you look at the staff, the team that Sanders has on the ground there, it's clear that he learned his lesson from 2016, where he went into the states that were more minority, more diverse in their voting, and he didn't really have a team that was able to deal with that. In this case, in many of these Super Tuesday states, he has a team that is all made up of minorities, and I think that's smart because it allows him to connect in a different way. I mean, let's face it, this is a 78-year-old old white guy from Vermont, and not exactly the easiest position to come from, the easiest demographic to connect with minority voters in the South. But he's put together a team that understands how to do that, and it's really smart on his part. And so I think this is a momentum and a surge that feels a lot different to me and looks more like some of the past successful Democrat campaigns that you've seen in terms of winning the nomination in the past. It looks more like a John Kerry or an Al Gore, those types going back to previous primaries.
Great insight, Chris. Appreciate you talking with Chris Wilson, political pollster, letting us know what to expect with Iowa, which is coming up February 3rd, I believe.
Yes, very soon.
Right around the corner.